الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيبنا رسول الله وعلى آله ومن والاه. اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وقل ربي زدني علما. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. وصلي اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. I know yesterday, obviously, the nature of the topic and the sensitivity and also the relationship to the topic, to the times that we're in, will engender naturally a lot of thought and questions, for some clarity, for others some confusion. That's just the nature of these problems. As long as we're in the world, there's going to be problems. It's just the nature of the abode. This is an abode in many ways of hayra. You know, one of the meanings of ilah is to confuse. Like if you think about God, you will get confused, which is why the Prophet prohibited thinking about the essence of God, but said rather think about the blessings, think about the attributes that manifest in the world. There is far more rahmah in the world than there is adab. And the proof of that is, according to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the majority of people do not consider suicide. And if the world was so intolerable with pain and severity, like some people who are in chronic illnesses actually do want to be put to death. But the vast majority of people do not want to be put to death. They want to live, even in the most excruciating circumstances, because the gift of life is so great. And so anyway, I wanted to look a little bit about this from an aqidah perspective. I mean, I thought what Sheikh Abdullah in Tanbih al-Maraji', awakening to the reference points, على تأصيل فقه الواقع, and substantiating pragmatic jurisprudence or reality-based fiqh, if you like, as opposed to fiction. Because there's a lot of fiction out there. So Imam al-Tahawi, he was a brilliant scholar, because he's known for his aqidah, but he was actually one of the giants of the Hanafi madhab. His book on the Hanafi madhab is considered really one of the foundational works. And he was originally a Shafi'i. His mother was a great faqiha in the Shafi'i madhab. She's actually called al-Tahawi, and she has an opinion in the Bab al-Zakat. She's actually quoted in many of the Shafi'i texts. So she was a mujtahida. His uncle was the great Imam al-Maziri, Muzani, afwan, Imam al-Muzani, who was one of the great ulama. But he noticed that whenever he had problems, he would look into the Hanafi books. So that got him curious. Like, if the Shafi'i madhab is enough for us, why is he dipping over into the Hanafi books to see what they had to say about it? So he got very curious, and he started studying the Hanafi madhab and became convinced, and then changed his madhab, which he's used as one of the proofs that it's permissible to change a madhab if you believe that it's a stronger madhab or it's easier for you. For instance, of all the madhabs, the one that you can learn the quickest is the Shafi'i madhab. It can be learned quicker than any other madhab. And that in and of itself is an encouragement, especially for more common people who want to learn their fiqh. The Hanafi madhab, the usul is very sophisticated, and the Maliki madhab, the usul is very sophisticated. The benefit of the sophistication is when you're in sophisticated societies, they're more amenable to those societies. So the Shafi'i madhab is a very, if you look at the places where it spread, it tended to spread in areas like Indonesia, Malaysia, East Africa, Yemen, in places where the societies were actually quite simple. And in the areas where there were Shafi'is, in sophisticated areas, they would tend to be ruled by Hanafis. So the Hanafi and the Maliki madhab spread in very complicated societies, like Andalusia, and the great empires of Islam tended to be either Hanafi or Maliki. The Hanbali, only recently has it ruled in Arabia. But traditionally it was not a madhab. It was a madhab of scholars, in fact. Very few common people were ever Hanbalis. It tended to be a madhab of scholars. It's a hadith-based. Shafi'i is hadith-based. Hanbali is hadith-based. Malik and Abu Hanifa are hadith-based, but they are also, there's a very strong rationalistic approach. So the naql and the aql are stronger. And that's not to say the Shafi'is didn't develop very sophisticated, because as time passed, they recognized some of the limitations, and so introduced things that enabled them to deal with complex situations. So Imam al-Tahawi, though, wrote this text, which is a very, I like what Rowan Williams, who was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, said about this translation. He said, the work is of value to others than Muslims for two reasons. It provides in 130 short paragraphs a clear presentation of core Muslim belief in a way that is not easily available by other means. So he says that. And secondly, it enables Christians who have also developed and continue to use creedal formulations with the opportunity to see just where the Islamic understanding of God comes close to the Christian understanding. But the point is that in 130 pithy statements, you can really get to the essence of the dogma. And it's important to distinguish between faith and dogma. And I'm using dogma in a positive term. People have heard me use that word before and think that I'm saying something derogatory because dogma has a negative for many people. But dogma is not a negative term in theology. Dogma is simply the creedal. It's what we call aqidah as opposed to iman. And there's a difference between aqidah and iman. You can have perfectly sound aqidah and very little iman. You can even be an Orientalist and know perfectly well the aqidah of the Muslims, but you don't believe it. And so aqidah and iman are different. And the focus on aqidah is as opposed to iman, where you're always checking people's aqidah. Because you can have incredibly strong faith and your aqidah might have problems with it. So it's good to correct that, but to denounce somebody as a mubtadi' or a disbeliever or something like that because of problems in their aqidah is very dangerous for Muslims to do that. It's alienating because people have strong belief, even if they have problems in their aqidah. So aqidah is very important and we don't underestimate it. But there's a lot of people that use it today as a kind of bludgeon, as this hammer to smash other Muslims with. And that's a serious problem. But the study of aqidah for the ulama was a vast study. And many of our great scholars were great theologians, like Taftazani, Abd-ud-Din al-Iji, Abu Bakr al-Baqallani, Imam al-Nawawi, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Fakhruddin al-Razi. These were great theologians who thought deeply about God and wrote extraordinary works. If you read the Maqasid, Taftazani's great work, if you read the Mawaqif, these are extraordinary testimonies to the genius of Islamic civilization. But this is a simple creed. It can be learned in a relatively short time. People have kind of attacked me for saying you can learn Aqidah in 5 minutes. But and obviously that's called hyperbole. If people studied balagha, they would understand he's obviously being hyperbolic, not hyperboling, but hyperbolic. But the point is, if you know Surah Al-Ikhlas, you have a solid foundation for Aqidah. And there are Sahaba who became Muslim, went into battle, and died without sitting down and learning all these creedal formulations. So they had sound faith, despite the fact they might not have known that, for instance, the prophets are better than the angels. They might not have known that specific Aqidah point because it hadn't been pointed out to them. But Surah Al-Ikhlas, if you say, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ Allahu Samad, Lam Yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Surah Al-Ikhlas تنفي ثمانية أشياء من الكفر. It negates 8 things from kufr. It negates التعدد and takathur or ta'addud. So it negates that something is, there are more than one of it, or it's a composite. So it negates for Allah ta'addud wa kathra. Allah is not, He doesn't have parts. He's infinite. He has no parts. And He's not more than one. So that first statement literally negates at-ta'addud wal-kathra. So if you think of God, you have to recognize He's one and He doesn't have any parts. He's not a composite. To use a Christian Western theological term from Aquinas, he would say He's simple as opposed to complex. In other words, and not simple, these are technical terms, so it doesn't mean simple like a simple person. No. It means that He has no parts. That would be the term Western theologians use for it. And then when you say قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ Allahu Samad, right? It negates Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it negates from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ Allahu Samad, that He has any need, right? Or aib, like He's not deficient, He doesn't need anything, right? He has no needs and no... So when you say Allahu Samad, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ يُحْتَاجُ إِلَيْهِ وَلَا يَحْتَاجُ إِلَى الشَّيْء. Everyone needs Allah, but Allah needs no one or no thing, right? So that negates that, any aib for Allah. He's not lacking. So He has everything He needs and He's not deficient in anything. And then when you say lam yalid wa lam yulad, it negates illa wa ma'luliyah. It negates cause and effect. He was not caused by anything, and He doesn't effect anything in a causative manner, because you can't separate a cause and effect. You see, so the way He brings things into existence is simply be and it is. It's not a cause and effect. He doesn't act on something in a cause and effect physics type of way. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. He doesn't bring anything into existence through illa and ma'luliyah, through cause and effect, and He's not brought into existence by anything. And when we say He's the first cause of things, this is a term that came out of the Hellenistic tradition. It doesn't mean cause and effect, and this is why the philosophers, Ibn Sina is accused of this. The philosophers from the Greeks argued that the universe, the cosmos, is coexistent with God. And the reason they said that is because Aristotle understood that cause and effect cannot be separated. And therefore, if God is the cause of the effect of the universe, you can't separate the two. So He's always existed with the universe. This was his understanding. So that's rejected in our tradition. We believe that the creation, like the Catholics, that it's ex nihilo, it comes out of nothing. Min al-adam ila al-wujud. One of the things Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya said, I know Sidi Faraz is dealing with a lot of this stuff, so my apologies to the Aqidah class. I don't want to step on any toes here. But and then finally, لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. It negates shabih wa nadhir. It negates anything that resembles God and anything that is equivalent to God. And the Quran uses these great dalils of tawarid and tamanu', which negate also the idea of God having anything equal to Him. So in his aqidah, and this is the section I wanted to think, he says, وَلَا نُنْزِلُ أَحَدًا مِّنْهُمْ جَنَّةً وَلَا نَارًا. That نَرَى الصَّلَاةَ خَلْفَ كُلِّ بَرٍّ وَفَاجِرٍ مِّنْ أَهْلِ الْقِبْلَةِ. We believe, we consider congregational prayer behind any of the people of Qibla, both virtuous and sinful, to be valid. One of the things that you're not supposed to pray behind a fajr, the ulama, I don't know about the other madhabs, but in the Maliki madhab, if he's called fasiqun bil jariha or fasiqun bil aqidah, then you're not supposed to pray behind him. I mean, some of the scholars that I knew, for instance, would not pray behind somebody if they didn't grow a beard, because they consider that fisqun bil jariha. That's more of a wara' position, because there's a khilaf about the beard. It's weak, but it's there. But they said if the ruler comes, you pray behind him. Even if he's a bad profligate, even if he's a fajr, you pray behind him, because just for the hurma of the government, the sanctity that a government has, and the obligation of obedience. So if you didn't pray behind him, it's like khuruj, be considered khuruj. So this is why he says this. And then he says, وَنُصَلِّ عَلَى مَنْ مَاتَ مِنْهُمْ, and we do the janazah prayer, the funeral prayer for anybody who died from amongst them. وَلَا نُنْزِلُ أَحَدًا مِّنْهُمْ جَنَّةً وَلَا نَارًا. We don't consider any of them to be in paradise or hell. So in other words, ta'yeen al-najat or ta'yeen al-khulud fi an-nar, this is the prerogative of God alone. And this is why you cannot say, unless Allah said he's in the hellfire, then we can't say that about anybody. Any person, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, you can't do that. Ta'yeen is haram in Islam, because it's God alone who has that judgment of what He knows, the variables of life. He knows how to judge people. We can judge by the outward. So if somebody died a kafir, then our deen says that the kuffar, those who reject God, are in hell. But that specific person, we can't judge where he is, because that's only Allah can do that. He knows that person. He knows what happened to that person, and He judges them, not us. We're not judges in any ultimate sense. And that's why it's very dangerous, like the man in the hadith who said, Allah will never forgive you. The Prophet said he's brought before God with that man he said that to, who was a bad man. And he said, for assuming my role in eternal judgment, then you're damned. And to show you I do whatever I want, I forgive him. Right? So that's a sound hadith. So watch out about saying who's going to hell and who's not. And then he says, وَلَا نَشْهَدُ عَلَيْهِمْ بِكُفْرٍ وَلَا بِشِرْكٍ وَلَا بِنِفَاقٍ. As long as they pray our qibla and eat مَنْ أَكَلَ ذَبِيحَتَنَا وَصَلَّى إِلَى قِبْلَتِنَا. Right? If they eat what we eat, the sacrifice, our meat, and if they pray our prayer, they're from the Muslims. So he's saying, we don't testify, we do not specify anyone among them to be either in paradise or hell. We do not accuse any of them of disbelief, idolatry, or hypocrisy, as long as none of that manifests from them. And that would be the prerogative of the judge or something. So there is apostasy in Islam, but you have to be very careful, because if you're not an alim, you can't make that assessment. And people are brought before courts traditionally for apostasy. وَلَمْ يَظْهَرْ مِنْهُمْ شَيْءٌ مِّنْ ذَلِكَ وَنَظَرُوا سَرَائِرَهُمْ إِلَى اللَّهِ. We leave their inner states, we resign their inner states to Allah, the Sublime, the Exalted. وَلَا نَرَى السَّيْفَ عَلَى أَحَدٍ مِّنْ أُمَّةِ مُحَمَّدٍ. We do not consider violence or coercive power against anyone from the community of Muhammad. This is Aqidah. This is actually what the Muslims believe, right? This is one of our earliest dogmatic texts, creedal texts of Aqidah. And it's agreed upon by all the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The Salafis use this text. There's some difference about how we interpret these meanings, but and that's why I translated it, because it is the agreed upon text of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Nobody differs about the things in this text. There's some slight interpretive differences. The Ash'aris, there's 4 masail in here that Ash'aris traditionally might have differed on, but the text is accepted. It's taught in places where Salafi texts are taught. So this is وَلَا نَرَى السَّيْفِ عَلَى أَحَدٍ مِّنْ أُمَّةِ مُحَمَّدٍ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم إِلَّا مَنْ وَجَبَ عَلَيْهِ السَّيْفِ. Here's the problem. That's called mustathna, right? The istithna. This is where everything happens. Who interprets إِلَّا مَنْ وَجَبَ عَلَيْهِ السَّيْفِ? And this is where all the khilaf come from. So the Khawarij say, wajib alayna an nakhruj alayhim. That's what the Khawarij say. So that's why the Prophet said, إِذَا اخْتَلَفْتُمْ فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالسَّوَادِ الْأَعْظَمِ. When there's differences, go with the majority, the jama'ah, and what the ulama say. And that's not the masses. Imam Malik, إِذَا قَالَ النَّاسِ قَصَدَ الْعُلَمَاءِ. If he said, النَّاسُ عِنْدَنَا, people in our community do this, he meant the ulama, the scholars. So that this is not for the ammi. Oh, you say, well, the majority of people are pro going against the government. No. You have to look, what do the musnadun amongst the ulama? The ulama in the tradition, يَحْمِلُ هَذَا الْعِلْمِ مِنْ كُلِّ قَرْنٍ عُدُولُهُ. That this knowledge is carried in each generation by upright people. What do they say? What do those ulama say? Because they will always exist in our ummah until the end. Those scholars will always exist. And you have to ask them what they say about this. Now, sometimes, to be fair, you will get people in that who will say, we should do that. And this is where the confusion comes. That's why fitna is called fitna, because even the ulama get caught up in it. And this is why in times of fitna, some people chose to just back out. Some of the Sahaba did not get involved in Muawiyah and Ali's conflict, even though we are Shia to Ali, right? We're with the Shia of Ali. Not the Rawafidah, right? But the Shia of Ali, that group was on the haqq. The people that stood by Ali, they were on the haqq. Both had ijtihad, but the Shia of Ali, the Shia just meant the group, the supporters. It became a political term later, but during that period, it just meant the group that was with Ali, Shia to Ali. And our ulama determined that they were rightly guided in that khilaf. The difference between us and the Rawafidah, who later are identified as the Shia, is that they rejected the ijtihad of Muawiyah and just threw him out of Islam, and rejected Abu Bakr and Umar, and that's rafd. It's to reject that. That's different from supporting Ali. And so that is the real first major fitna. So some of the ulama of the Sahaba, like Abdullah ibn Umar, some of them said, I'm not going to fight with Muslims. And they backed out. That is an ijtihad. Muawiyah's group made ijtihad, Amr ibn al-As. Ali made ijtihad. Who was right? Our ulama later, after the event, said Ali's ijtihad was the correct ijtihad. But they said that Muawiyah was making an ijtihad. Each one of them was trying to preserve. So this is the difference. And then he says, وَلَا نَرَى الْخُرُوجَ عَلَىٰ أَئِمَّتِنَا وَوُلَاةِ أُمُورِنَا وَإِنْ جَارُوا. We do not accept any rebellion against our leaders or the administrators of our public affairs, even if they are oppressive. This is the aqidah of the Muslims. I mean, this is the aqidah. So what am I supposed to do with a statement like that? If you tell me we have to go out against the government, and our Salaf said, and they all agreed that this was rightly guided, they said, وَلَا نَرَى الْخُرُوجَ عَلَىٰ أَئِمَّتِنَا وَوُلَاةِ أُمُورِنَا وَإِنْ جَارُوا. Even if they're oppressive, why did he put that in there? وَإِنْ جَارُوا. He could have just said, وَلَا نَرَى الْخُرُوجَ عَلَىٰ أَئِمَّتِنَا وَوُلَاةِ أُمُورِنَا. But he put in وَإِنْ جَارُوا because he knew people are going to come along and say, لَكِنْهُمْ جَارُوا عَلَيْنَا لَا يَجُوزُ يَحِقُّ لَنَا أَن نَخْرُجَ عَلَيْهِمْ. لا وَإِنْ جَارُوا. وَإِنْ جَارُوا. Even if they, and jawr is the worst thing. In fact, لا يستقيم الدولة بالجور. I mean, our ulama said eventually jawr will end dynasties because it's adala. You know, Aristotle said a very interesting thing. He said, الحكومة مبنية على عدالة والعدالة مبنية على جيش قوة. Right? You have to have, in order to establish justice, you have to have power to do it. والجيش مبني على التجار. Right? Because you have to fund your army, and so you need taxes and you need to support, right? والتجار مبني على السوق. And the tujar have to have a marketplace for them to transact. والسوق مبنية على العدالة. And the suq is based on justice. So it's a da'ira. Justice is what maintains everything. It maintains the marketplace. It maintains the government. It maintains the soldiers. It maintains the tujar. Without justice, none of these, you'll always have khalal. And so this is why adala is so important in our religion. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. ولا نرى الخروج على أئمتنا وولاة أمورنا وإن جاروا ولا ندعو على أحد منهم ولا ننزع يدا من طاعتهم. We don't I could interpret, but I want to see, because I spent a long time on this text translating it, so I'd rather look at it, right? And so we also do not pray for evil to befall any one of them or withdraw our allegiance from them. Because the yad here is isti'ara for our bay'ah. Or withdraw our allegiance from them. We consider our civic duty to them concordant with our duty to Allah, the Sublime and Exalted, and legally binding on us, unless they command us to the immoral. We pray for probity. We pray for probity, success, and welfare. So, when he says, لَا نَنْزَعُ يَدًا مِنْ طَاعَتِهِمْ, we don't remove our allegiance from them. The ta'a. Now this gets back to what Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayyah said. There's ta'atul ihtimal and ta'atul imtithal. There is an obedience that is negative. It simply means that we bear their oppression. That's a negative obedience. And the reason for that is not because we accept the oppression. It's because we know that going against them will lead to greater oppression. It's just irtikab khaf ad-dararain. That's the hukum. It's taking the lesser of two evils. By going against the government, we create much more oppression than bearing the problem. But then people say, well, how do we get rid of the oppression? Well, the first thing is, مَا ظَلَمْنَاهُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا ظَلَمْنَاهُمْ وَلَكِنْ أَنفُسُهُمْ كَانُوا يَظْلِمُونَ. But they were oppressing themselves. So the first question, and this is in Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. If you look at that letter, it's a very interesting letter because one of the things he says, if we're going to challenge our oppressors, the first thing we have to do is look into ourselves and ask the question, do we have these negative qualities that we want them to get rid of? And if we do, we have to purify ourselves or else we have no moral capital. And that's tasawwuf, that's the traditional, that's it. And this is where you see Abu Hamid, Abu Hamid, to me, is such an interesting person in our history. Because Abu Hamid was living at a time when it was one of the great, it's the greater Seljuk Empire, before the Anatolian. This is the capital of the Salajiqa, the Seljuks in Anatolia. But the Seljuks begin in Central Asia, and they remove the Ghaznavids, which was another great dynasty. They solidify, they take over Persia, Central Asia, Iraq. They have a capital in Baghdad. And if the pre-modern world was much more like principalities. You didn't have this kind of unified type of government. Every principality was almost an independent, but they had to send taxes to the central government. So it was more like a federation where you have, in America, you have states, and I apologize for using this. But it's the thing I'm most familiar with. I know Australia has states, and I could use, if I was Australian, I would use examples from Australia. Turkey has states. I mean, I would use other examples, but so I know not everybody's from America, and I know Americans tend to forget that there is other parts in the world. But I'm just using what I'm familiar with. We have a federation, which, so you have Washington, which is the federal government, and then you have all these states. Each state has its own constitution. Each state has certain rights that it can do, but it has to send taxes to the federal government. This is, in a sense, with less, the Muslim world, because of the nature of communications, although they did have a pretty extraordinary system of carrier pigeons, so they were actually capable of communicating over large distances in relatively short periods of time. But generally, they were independent. Like in India, you had the Mughals, and you had independent states like Hyderabad, and Bangalore and Kerala. These were independent states, but they were all under this basic empire. And then the Ottomans were very similar. When the Ottomans controlled Iraq, they had 3 vilayat. They called them vilaya. They had 3 wilayat, or states. They had the Kurdish state, they had the Sunni state, and they had the Shia state. And they were separate because they were much more intelligent than modern people, trying to stick everybody together and force them to live together with very different adat and taqalid, with different norms and things. So they actually administratively allowed each wilaya to run on its own. So the Kurds had their own administration, the Sunnis had their own administration, and the Shia had their own administration. So that system, Imam al-Ghazali was living at a time at the height of Islamic power, really. But despite that, there were all these problems. And this is the human condition. During his lifetime, Malik Shah, who was a great ruler, was afflicted by the Batinists. These are the occultists. These are people that work within a religion to undermine the religion. At that time, they were called Nizari Ismailis. These are the Batini group and at their highest level, they didn't believe in morality. They thought morality was for the common people. It was a way of controlling the common people. Very similar to what's happening in our culture now, is that the occultists are coming out openly, allowing what was only done amongst the elite. Now they're letting the masses do these things. Because traditionally, religion was used by the elite to control the masses, to control their morality, to control their wealth, to control family structures, all of this. That's why traditionally the ruling elite was very concerned about these things. Now the law is do what thou wilt, do whatever you want. The utilitarian harm principle of John Stuart Mill, coming out of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill said in his book on freedom that every group of people should be allowed to do whatever they want as long as they don't harm anybody else. This is the harm principle, that this really should be the determinant in society. If they're harming somebody else, then the government should stop them. But if they're not, even if they're harming themselves, the government should leave them alone, because that's real freedom. This is hurriya. That philosophy has become the dominant philosophy in the West. It's still not the dominant philosophy in the Muslim world. Robert George, the brilliant professor of law from Princeton, wrote a book called On Making Men Moral, which is the aspect of the government that there is a type of legislation to preserve the society. That there are things that we don't want people doing because it's harmful to society. And one of the great challenges of any society, whether it's Turkey or Egypt or Saudi Arabia or America, it doesn't matter. One of the great challenges is the relationship between the community and the individual. In many parts of the world, collectivism becomes the dominant mode, which the Marxist impulse was a collectivist impulse, where the individual loses his rights for the greater good. In the West, the individual rights are put over the community rights. So very often the community, you take your children to the grocery store and there's all these pornographic pictures on the covers of magazines because this is freedom. And the individual has a right to sell what they want and do what they want. So you go into a convenience store and there are these pictures, or a bus with naked men and women in a Calvin Klein commercial on a huge bus, or in their underwear. And this is freedom. And so my child, who I'd like to protect, and also myself from these things, I don't have any right here, because the community loses its right for the rights of individuals. These are the problems that every society has to grapple with. Islam tends to side on the side of the individual, but it gives great credence to the rights of the community. But Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya said, he was at a conference in Qatar, and the day before they had a philosopher from America, and he had argued that individuality was the most important thing, individual rights. And there was a group of Muslim scholars there who was saying, no, collective rights, it's the community, and they went on and on. The next day when Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya came, he asked what they'd been talking about. And they explained the debate. And the Sheikh said that he tended to side, actually shocking the other Muslims, that the Western approach was closer to the Islamic, that the rights of the individual are extremely important in the Islamic tradition, but the rights of the community are also considered, especially about morality. But the rights of the individual in Islam are very, very important. We have a huquq, and those huquq are not to be infringed upon. The right to be safe in your home is a human right that Islam has granted, and that's why the government can't come into your home. Like Omar, when he heard the men drinking, and he burst in, and he said, and they said, well, look at what if we're doing one haram, look how many harams you've done. And they counted out, even the bad guys in Medina were fuqaha, right? And so Omar had to admit, that it was wrong what he did. La tajassusu. They said, la tajassusu. And then you're looking at this red stuff that we're drinking. How do you know it's not grape juice? Right? Inna ba'd al-dhanni itham. Some of... So, this is our religion. It recognizes, it tries to find a balance between these two, but the individual right is over the right of the community. And this is why Abu Hanifa said to consider, 1,000 guilty people innocent is better than considering one innocent man guilty. And that's why the bar in Islamic law is so high for prosecution. It's very high. It's much higher than the Western bar. Most of these cases these cases in the United States that are brought would be thrown out in Islamic law, because you need witnesses for a lot of things. It's very difficult to prove things in Islam. And the reason for that is because the individual has so many rights. I mean, the ird is protected, your dignity. And this is why slander and libel in the West, we have horrible laws of slander and libel. You can say anything about anybody if they're a public figure. You can say anything you want about a public figure and nothing. But in Islam, if you say something about somebody and challenge their dignity, no, you're punished. If you accuse somebody of adultery and you don't have 4 witnesses and saw penetration, you're the one that's punished. Because it's so insidious. Once you accuse somebody of something, suspicion enters the minds of people. So somebody's accused of pedophilia, people, they're always going to have that question mark. You know, you accuse them of sexual harassment, that question mark, did he or didn't he? We believe you, Anita, for people that know that issue. Again, apologies to the Australians and others. I'm sure you have your cases like that too. But. So, and then والحج والجهاد فرضان ماضيان مع أولي الأمر من أئمة المسلمين برهم وفاجرهم إلى قيام الساعة لا يبطلهما شيء ولا ينقضهما. So the Hajj and Jihad are perpetual obligations that are carried out under legitimate Muslim rulers, irrespective of their personal probity, whether they're good or bad, until the end of time. Nothing can nullify or rescind them. Now, what is jihad? And that's where the question comes. He mentions Hajj and Jihad together because Hajj is the jihad of women. Because Aisha asked the Prophet, do women have jihad? He said yes, and there's no fighting in it. It's called Hajj. So the Hajj and Jihad are together, and also the Imam has to establish the Hajj, make sure that the pilgrims are protected, that they're given water, food if they need it, things like that. So Jihad, ta'riful Jihad, the definition of Jihad, right, is badl al-juhd, right, fi difa' an ad-din. It's expending your energies to defend the religion, right? So Jihad it means many things. And Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, said that kullu qurbatin jihad. Every act of devotion that gets you towards Allah is a type of jihad, right? Al-mujahidu man jahada hawahu. The Prophet ﷺ said, the jihad, the mujahid is the one who struggles against his own passions, his own lower desires. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبَلَنَا وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Those who do jihad for our sake. This is in Surah Al-Ankabut. This verse was revealed before the verses permitting qital. كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالِ. Fighting has been decreed for you, prescribed for you. Those verses came before, right? And then وَجَاهِدْهُمْ بِهِ بِالْقُرْآنِ. So there's jihad al-lisan, there's the jihad of the tongue. These are all forms of jihad. So Shaykh Abdullah said in the early period there was a khilaf about jihad al-talab, right? A offensive jihad and a defensive jihad. Some of the ulama said jihad is only defensive. Why? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Don't be aggressors. Allah doesn't love the aggressors. His love is not fickle like some people's. Right? You have fickle love, right? Her love was fickle. Like one day she loves me not. That's fickle love, right? Allah's love does not, لا يتغير حبه لا يتغير. فإذا قال لا يحب المعتدين إلى أن تقوم الساعة. He doesn't love aggression. Allah does not love aggression. And therefore they said, if you aggress against somebody, now, some of the ulama argued that it really is defensive even when it's offensive because what you're doing is preemptive. The Arabs used to say, الروم إذا لا تغزى تغزو. If the Byzantines, if you don't first attack them, eventually they're going to attack you. Preemptive war is a very dangerous doctrine. This was the American doctrine of the neocons, this idea of preemptive war. Hitler believed in preemptive war. Eisenhower condemned it, saying that that once you open that door, it's the door for just oppression and expansion. But the Muslims differed. But they understood, nonetheless, it was always to promote good, to create freer societies where there was freedom of religion, including allowing people to be disbelievers and to protect them from the aggression of others. So, like this Pax Americana, this idea that some neoconservative have of creating a global, peaceful civilization by having these, these powers that stop evildoers. The Muslims had very similar idea, right? They had this idea that we should make the world safe for religion, all religion. Because religious persecution is the worst type of persecution in the Quran. To be persecuted for what you believe. There should be freedom of thought. This was the idea. Even the atheists could live in the Muslim society, and there were many atheists that lived to ripe old ages in the Islamic civilization. So the Muslims were open to these things. But what Sheikh Abdullah said, this debate is over in the modern world. To say that there's offensive jihad, that you can aggressively attack another country, is an act of insanity. And he said, نحكم عليهم بالجنون من قال الآن بجهاد الطلب هذا جنون. Because الأسلحة مدمرة, these weapons of mass destruction now that we have, it makes it an act of madness to do that. And so he's totally opposed to it in that way. So, in conclusion, on this section, I wanted to So one of the things that the Sheikh is very concerned about is he said, مسألة الطاعة وردت الأحاديث الكثيرة بالأمر بها مطلقة وبعضها بالمعروف مقرونة ومقيدة وهكذا اضطرب الفقهاء. هل الطاعة هي امتثال الشرع إذا أمر به الحاكم امتثال القانون، أم الطاعة هي لشخص الحاكم؟ هل الطاعة توجب أمره في الجائزات باعتباره مصلحة وتحرم مخالفته؟ وما هي حقيقتها واستحقاقاتها؟ أم هناك طاعة أخرى من أجل سد ذريعة الفتنة والاحتراب لتقدير الإسلام لدماء الناس؟ أم أنها طاعة سلبية، طاعة انكفاف وليست طاعة امتثال؟ أم أن الأمر يرجع إلى الوضع الزماني ليحقق فيه المناط من خلال الوثائق الدستورية في هذا الزمان؟ الخروج هل ما زال مخالفة الحاكم لمنع حق أو لخلعه الباغية طائفة خالفت الإمام؟ والذي يظهر لي والعلم عند العليم الحكيم بعد مراجعة الأحاديث الآمرة بالطاعة الناهية عن نزع اليد منها وتلك مقيدة بالمعروف أو مقيدة بالمعروف هي الناهية عن الطاعة في المنكر، أن الطاعة لها معنيان يدل عليهما السياق. المعنى الأول الطاعة التي تعني عدم الخروج على الحاكم وعدم استهداف النظام العام، وهذه هي التي لا يجوز الخروج عليها إلا بعد خروج الإمام خروجا لا شك فيه ولا ريب من الإسلام، وهي طاعة الجمهور التي تعني لزوم الجماعة، وهي طاعة السلبية أو طاعة الانكفاف وعدم الاعتراض. والمعنى الثاني الطاعة الشخصية للقيام بعمل تجب إذا كان مشروعا ولا تجوز إذا كان غير جائز ولكنه لا يسمح بالخروج. وبعبارة أخرى فإن الطاعة طاعتان، طاعة احتمال وطاعة امتثال. ولا ينافي ما ذكر في الطاعة القاعدة الشرعية المعروفة، وهي أن تصرف الإمام على الرعية منوط بالمصلحة، وأصلها للشافعي كما يقول السيوطي في الأشباه، وقد ذكرها العز بن عبد السلام وتلميذه القرافي وابن نجيم وغيرهم، وهي مستنبطة من الكتاب ولا تقربوا مال اليتيم إلا بالتي هي أحسن، ومن السنة ففي الصحيحين ما من عبد استرعاه والله رعية فلم يحطها بنصيحة إلا لم يجد رائحة الجنة. لكن من يحدد المصلحة ويحقق المناط الظاهر من النصوص أن الجهة الولائية هي المرجحة لأن المختلف فيه بإمضاء الإمام يصير متفقا عليه كما يقول السرخسي في شرح السير الكبير. So this is very important. He said that one of the things that the fuqaha differed on about the nature of obedience, then what is obedience to the ruler, is imtithal al-shara'. So is it that we have to obey the sharia when the ruler tells us to obey? And he calls this imtithal al-qanun, like obeying the law. So you have laws and you should obey. Is that what it means? Or is the ta'ah the person of the ruler? So is it the rule of law or is it the rule of the ruler? And then is this obedience tujibu amruhu fil jaiz, is it necessary in permissible things if they're maslaha, if they're beneficial? And is it prohibited to go against that? These are questions he's asking. And what's its reality? What's its haqiqah? What's the reality of it? And then what are the consequences of that reality? What follows from it? What are the things owing to it? Or is there a different type of obedience, which is sadd al-dhari'a, it's to protect, it's cutting off pretext of fitna and civil war, ihtirab, civil wars, and especially given the value that Islam holds for the shedding of blood. Blood is very, very valuable in the Islamic tradition. Or is it a negative type of obedience? In other words, that we simply don't oppose the ruler, and it's not a positive obedience that we have to do what he says. In other words, we don't go against the ruler. Or is it look at the time and the place? ليحقق فيه المناط من خلال الوثائق الدستورية. So, تحقيق المناط, the usuli scholars, these scholars of Islamic law, have different types of approach to situations. So they have, takhrij, tanqih, and tahqiq. The manat is the contingency of taklif. It's where you're responsible. So for instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has two discourses. He has what's called khitab al-taklif and khitab al-wada'. Khitab al-taklif is, for instance, aqimu salah. Allah says, establish a prayer. Al-amr yadullu ala al-wujub. When Allah commands you to do something, it means obligation, unless there's an indication that it's not. Like kulu wa sharabu. That's imperative. Eat and drink. Obviously, when you're hungry, eat. It's mubah, right? Eat and drink. Wala tusrifu. It's for nadab. Don't do it to excess. So it's mandub not to eat or drink to, it's makruh to do it excessively. If it's excessive to the point of harm, it becomes haram. So if you have diabetes, the doctor tells you don't eat sweets, that's ta'ayyana alayk. Because sometimes a legal ruling applies to ashkhas, but not to the society. These are points of difference. So the khitab at-taklif, which is the divine discourse to individual. So if you ask me, is the prayer an obligation? Your average Muslim is going to say, absolutely, it's wajib. If you ask an usuli scholar, is the prayer an obligation? They'll say that depends. Are you a Muslim? Have you reached maturity? Are you menstruating? Do you have access to water or earth? So they're going to look at it differently, right? Because this is called taklif, this is called khitab al-wada'. So the taklif says you have to pray. The wada' determines the situation of whether you have to pray or not. This is the distinction. Wada' is three things: asbab, shurut, and mawani'. So it's got the asbab. So the point the sun reaches 90 degrees, according to Ibn Arafah in his hudud, 1 degree away from 90 degrees. So the sun moves 1 degree away. That's 4 minutes it takes to move 1 degree away. At the point it reaches 91 degrees, dhuhr has become an obligation. It's a sabab for wujub salat al-dhuhr. That's the sabab. So now, before dhuhr, your taklif al-wada' said you can't pray dhuhr. There was a mani'. There was a preventative. It was saying it's not dhuhr time, therefore you can't pray dhuhr. So if you prayed dhuhr when it was at 89 degrees, your prayer is invalid. Because even though the khitab al-taklif, the discourse of obligation says dhuhr is wajib, it has conditions. It has asbab, it has shurut, and it has mawani'. One of the shurut is that you have to be tahir. That's a condition. So the mani' is that you don't have tahara. So I can't pray because I'm not in wudu or I'm not in ghusl. So that's wada', that's your situation. Every legal ruling has a khitab taklif and a khitab wada'. Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayy says that one of the greatest crises in our ummah is splitting these two. So people say jihad is wajib, but it has asbab, it has shurut, and it has mawani'. So if you're going to kill yourself and it's suicidal, jihad is haram. Because Allah prohibits suicide. لا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة. لا تقتلوا أنفسكم إن الله كان بكم رحيما. ففي هذا الوضع لا يجوز يحرم عليكم الجهاد. If you have somebody conquers you and they have nuclear weapons and you don't have nuclear weapons, سقط الجهاد. Because they'll annihilate you and Allah is not telling you to get annihilated. He's saying, convert them to Islam and then they become weapons for the Muslims. At least try to convert them. That's what the Muslims did with the Mongols. The Mongols invaded and they said, you know what? They actually, if you read T.B. Arnold's book on the preaching of Islam, he said that the ulama got together and said, you know what? We can't defeat these people. They're too powerful militarily. The Muslims have gotten weak. We're supposed to prepare because we believe in deterrence. Look at deterrent. Deterrent, لِتُرْهِبُوا عَدُوَ اللَّهِ وَعَدُوَّكُمْ irhab. They think irhab is terrorism. No, the irhab here is deterrent. What does deterrent mean in English? De terrere, out of fear. A deterrent prevents people from attacking you because they're afraid of you. That's what the Muslims want. They don't want to terrorize others. They want others to be afraid of terrorizing them. And now we've switched it. We've made Islam look like terrorism, when Islam should look like a deterrent. That's the irhab of Islam. It's to frighten people from attacking. Be strong. Like, it's a very American idea. Teddy Roosevelt walked home and carry a big stick so people don't mess with you. That's the idea. It's not to go around picking on people or bullying people like some countries do because they have big sticks. No, it's to have a big stick so other countries don't terrorize you. So this is what Shaykh Abdullah is saying, that we have to restore the integrity of the khitab al-wada' and the khitab al-taklif, to bring them back together, to recognize when the shurut are there, when the asbab are there, when the mawani' are there. There are mawani' to jihad. The Prophet ﷺ, he sent people, right? He went out, his last ghazwa, right? When he went out to Tabuk and he realized, because there were rumors that they were going to attack the Muslims. So he got an army together, he went out, we're going to defend ourselves. Jihad, defend. When he got there, he realized, they're not trying to attack us. No fighting. He went back home. If they don't want to attack you, he said, "Utrukuhum atarakukum." The Turks, leave them alone as long as they leave you alone. Because he knew ulul bas, right? Sayyidina Umar didn't want to fight the Turks because they were powerful people. Don't mess with the Turks, right? But if they mess with you, you have to mess with them. That's Malcolm. Malcolm used to say, our religion is that good old time religion. Treat people with respect. But if they lay their hand on you, send them to the cemetery. Right? That's Islam. And if you can't send them to the cemetery, try to convert them to your religion. or call them to their highest principles, the better angels of their nature. Don't you believe in equality? Don't you believe in democracy? Don't you believe in the rights of people to self-determination? Don't you believe all these things? Why are you forcing your laws on us? Why are you telling us your culture is the only culture? I mean, this is one of the arrogances of the West. You see, the West, when they were Christians, they wanted everybody to be Christian. Now they don't really believe in Christianity, so they want everybody to be capitalists and consumers. They used to be against homosexuality, and they would punish homosexuality wherever they went. The Muslims, oddly enough, were far more tolerant of transvestites. There's a whole tradition of transvestites in the Muslim world. There was a period where one of the caliph's mothers used to dress up the girls as boys. These things this is just human history. If you read human history, one of the things that shocked me when I was studying Arabic literature was what were called the ghulamiyat. All of these hebephilic poetry, which was homoerotic poetry. I thought it was very weird, but homosexuality has been around for a long, long time, but nobody permitted it. So you had, in the Muslim world, you had these mukhannathun that go to weddings. They still do it in India and Pakistan and Mauritania. Even in Mauritania, you've got these, they dress up like women and they talk funny and people laugh. They're like comedians, like Dame Edna or something. But when the Christians came, you persecuted those people, right? Like the khuntha, the hermaphrodite. Muslims always had fiqh, specialty for transgender people. There was fiqh for those people. But now they don't believe in their book anymore, so they want to force everybody to accept their idea of marriage. We've redefined marriage, and the whole world has to accept it. This is the ethnocentric nature of this civilization. It's a very arrogant civilization. I come from it, so, it's a very arrogant civilization, and unfortunately also there's a lot of arrogance in Muslims as well, because they believe that a lot of Muslims think their will should be imposed on everybody else. It's not our sharia. People can do what they want. In a Muslim society that's ruled by Muslims with an agreement, a social contract with Muslims. And democracy even is what they call the tyranny of the majority. But when the majority of Muslims want certain laws, they say, oh, no, can't have that. Why not? Because we don't agree with it. But I thought you said democracy is what the majority want. Only if it's what we want, our majority wants. Anyway, these are the problems. So he says about this. So that's the tahqiq, all right, of manat. It's determining, does the ruling apply in this specific situation? And this is what the usuli scholar has to do, which is why Imam al-Qushayri said the usuli scholars are the generals of our civilization. They're the generals. Hum quwwad al-ummah, right? The faqih is like the administrator. The muhaddith is like the khazin. He's the one that protects the treasures, right? And the qurra, they protect. But the usuli is the general. He's the one that strategically determines what's the appropriate thing. Iqamat al-hudud takhtassu bil-imam. To establish hudud, this is a qaida fiqhiyya. It's a legal principle in our tradition. Establishing penal punishments in Islam is specific to the ruler. The ruler can suspend penal punishments based on ijtihad. Like Umar radiallahu anhu during Am al-Ramada, he stopped any punishment for theft because there was so much widespread suffering that people were stealing food to feed their children. So he saw that the hukm in this case is not to apply the hukm. That's tahqiq al-manat. Haqq al-manat. Because he said there's a mani'. There's something here to prevent the establishing the ruling, which is darura, necessity. People are doing this out of necessity, and necessity permits the impermissible. Even in Christianity, St. Thomas Aquinas said theft is permissible if somebody's starving to death and nobody will feed them charitably. in Christianity, Catholic canon law, that a person can steal food if nobody will feed them and they're starving. So they pass by a bakery, they break the window, they take the bread. They have a right. Because haqqul inqad, the right to have your life saved, that's a human right. If you see somebody drowning and you know how to swim, by Sharia, it's an obligation to attempt to save them. It's a haqq that that person has over you. Haqqul inqad. So, he said, هل ما زال مخالفة الحاكم لمنع حقنا أو لخلعه. So, al-khuruj, going out, the baghiya, the ta'ifa, is the one that goes against the imam. He says, الذي يظهر لي, what appears to me, والعلم عند العليم الحكيم. Allah knows best. And this is the mujtahid, is humility. He's saying, look, يظهر لي, I'm an usuli scholar. I've been studying this subject for over 50 years. Sheikh's 80 years old. When he was 20 years old, he was a mufti. He memorized the 10 qira'at of the Quran. He studied tafsir. He's a master of the Arabic language. He studied all the hadith. I've heard him say on many occasions, I asked him about a hadith, he said, it's not in the 6. It's not in the 6 books of hadith. Many times he said, laysa fi sitta. Laysa fi kutub sitta. So he's got, it's like when you put something in maktab al-shamila, and it goes, no, la yujadu. That's what it says after your bahth, right? Natijat al-bahth, la yujadu. Not there. He scans through his own computer, right? It's not in the sitta. He mastered the tradition of usul. I was once with Ahmed Shugairi, and Ahmed had read a book about usul al-fiqh, and he mentioned something. I said, I don't think that's mashhur, that opinion. He said, but it was in the book. I said, well, there's lots of things in books that are dangerous. And I said, but let's ask the sheikh when he comes in. So he came in, I asked Sheikh Abdullah, what do you say about this, one of the fuqaha? He said this. He said, there's 8 opinions on that subject. And then he gave all 8, and he said, that's the weakest of the 8. And he said, this is the... And that's the way he is. I mean, I've spent over 20 years with him. He's still... I'm amazed at his... I asked him not that long ago about Kahlan and Himyar. The Yemenis are Qahtani. You have Adnani, Qahtani. So the Yemenis are Qahtani from Yashjub, Ibn Ya'rub, Ibn Qahtan. So they go back to this. But Qahtan splits into Himyar and Kahlan. They have 2 branches. So the Ghasasina, Al-Aws wal Khazraj are from Kahlan, right? So I asked the Sheikh, I was asking him something about Kahlan and Himyar. He quoted, because he memorizes a poem on Ansab, he quoted like a whole qasida on the difference between Kahlan and Himyar. It was like a masala far'iyya, yani fil Ansab. That's his knowledge. So when he says, وَالَّذِي يَظْهَرُ لِي, what appears to me, we take it seriously, because this is somebody who's studied all these things. He's got a genius in and of himself, but he has an encyclopedic knowledge of the tradition, and he's saying, here's what it appears to me. وَالْعِلْمُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ الْحَكِيمُ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ بَعْدَ مُرَاجَعَةِ الْأَحَادِيثِ الْآمِرَ بِالطَّاعَةِ. After I've looked at all the hadiths that command to obey the rulers and prohibit removing our hand of obedience from them. And some of them are muqayyada. So taqyid, you have muqayyad and mutlaq. Something, you have am and khas. So you have things that are mutlaq, they're absolute, and then you have things that are muqayyad, like they constrain or determine. They're regulators of mutlaq. So, and this is in usul al-fiqh. So he says some of them are qualified by ma'ruf, that you do them, obey them in ma'ruf. And nahi an ta'i fil munkar. So some of them say you can't obey them. La ta'ati li makhluqin fi ma'asiyat al-khaliq. Most Muslims know that rule. You can't obey a ruler if it means disobeying the Creator, right? So he says, after I've looked at all of these, أَنَّ الطَّاعَةَ لَهَا مَعْنَيَانِ. Obedience has 2 meanings in our religion. يَدُلُ عَلَيْهِمَا السِّيَاقِ. And the context of these hadiths indicate these two different meanings. المعنى الأول, the first meaning, الطاعة التي تعني عدم الخروج على الحاكم. The first meaning is that you can't rebel against a ruler. وعدم استهداف النظام العام. And you cannot undermine the public order. Nizam. And I was saying it's very interesting that when these rebels talk about, like in Syria, when they talk about who they're fighting, they use the word in Arabic, nilam. The order. So what's the opposite of nilam? Fawda, anarchy. Because they don't have any nizam. Because they've got all these different groups, each one fights the other, but they're fighting the order, the nizam. I don't like the nizam. I really don't. I don't like Bashar or any of these things. But when people say, تؤيد النظام, نعم, أؤيد النظام لغة. I believe in public order. Yes, I'm against فوضى. لا يصلح الناس فوضى لا سراة. ولا سراة إذا جهالهم ساد. Like the Jahidi poet said, anarchy will never help. People will never do well in anarchy. When you don't have good rulers, they'll never do well in anarchy. And then he said, and there's no benefit in having ignorant rulers because that will eventually lead to anarchy. So, وهذه التي لا يجوز الخروج عليها إلا بعد خروج الإمام خروجا لا شك فيه ولا ريب من الإسلام. And you cannot go out of there until the Imam leaves Islam in a way that's absolutely certain. You have no doubt that he is a disbeliever. So if he's establishing prayer, and then even still, if you can't win, you don't go out. Muslims have been under disbelievers many, many times in history where they didn't fight them because they knew that it was suicide. وهي طاعة الجمهور, this is the obedience of the masses التي تعني لزوم الجماعة وهي طاعة سلبية. So this is a negative type of obedience. It's not going against them or rebelling. And the second meaning is الطاعة الشخصية للقيام بعمل. It's to obey the individual when he commands you to do an action. تجب إذا كان مشروعا, that is an obligation if the action is legitimate, if it's justified by Sharia, and it's not permitted if it's prohibited by the Sharia. لكنه لا يسمح بالخروج, but you still can't go against them in that case. And so this is his Sheikh's contribution. He said the ibaras he's using, he's invented these mustalahat, and he's done this in several things because they're very useful. He calls one طاعة الاحتمال يحتمل, to just اصبروا على أذاهم, to be patient with their harm. That's called ta'atul ihtimal. And the other one is called ta'atul imtithal. So one is the obedience of patience, and the other is the obedience of implementing what they're telling you to implement when it's accepted. And he said this does not in any way contradict the legal principle, which is very well known, أن تصرف الإمام على الرعية منوط بالمصلحة. That the imam, in terms of how he treats his subjects or his citizens, is contingent upon common weal or benefit. أصلها للشافعي. It's a principle that Imam Shafi'i rooted, according to Imam Suyuti, and it's based on the ayah in the Quran, don't go near the wealth of the orphan, and except in a good way. So it's maslaha. That's the qa'idah. لا تتصرف في مال اليتيم إلا بمصلحة. So تصرف الإمام منوط بالمصلحة. تصرف الإمام في الرعية منوط بالمصلحة. It's based on that ayah. هو بناء على هذه الآية وكذلك في الحديث ومن السنة وفي الصحيحين in متفق عليه إمام البخاري and إمام مسلم ما من عبد استرعاه والله رعية فلم يحطها بنصيحة إلا ولم يجد رائحة الجنة. No servant, slave, abd, is given the responsibility of looking after a people, ra'iyah, and then he's not sincere with them. In other words, doesn't work for the common good, except that he won't smell. He will not smell the ra'ihat al-jannah, the scent of paradise. Alhamdulillah. So anyway, hopefully I've exhausted this subject so people can understand this position from a traditional position and why we're against oppression, but we're also against rebellion against oppressors if that rebellion is going to lead to greater harm, because it's prohibited to do that. So people say, there's questions like, what do we do? What do we do? Well, that's a good question. Given the recent Supreme Court ruling on marriage and recent open letter by Riza Aslan, how do Muslims recognize individual civil rights and balance that against communal protection for immoralities? I haven't read, I've kind of been out of touch because I was overseas. I haven't read. Riza Aslan, whatever he said about same-sex marriage, he does an amazing job on television defending Muslims generally. I mean, really. And so we should be very happy to have somebody like that who's as telegenic, who's as intelligent and as educated as that. He might make some mistakes in his understanding or his ijtihad. That's fine. His good, certainly in my estimation, in the public eye, in the United States, outweighs any other considerations for me personally. I'm not going to support him in everything he does or everything he says, but overall, he's a great good for our community to have somebody as articulate as that, and also just pleasant, you know, even though he's firm and strong. I mean, Aslan, I think, means lion in Persian. You know, he's like a lion sometimes. I mean, he just shuts them up, you know. Like he'll ask these guys, are you listening to yourself? Did you hear what you just said? You know, because they're so stupid sometimes. They really are stupid people, some of these people. You just wonder how they got those jobs. Why are Muslims so oppressive to women? You know, okay, did you take the, 700 million Muslim women and do a really serious survey about how they're doing? Yeah. Why are Americans so oppressive to women? That's a good question too. You know, why are men so oppressive to women? That's an even better question, right? But not all women are oppressed and not all men are oppressors, right? So, you know, and then also, like, who the hell are you to determine whether the Saudi women feel oppressed or not? Because a lot of these Saudi women, you know, well, they say, well, that's double consciousness. You know, they just don't know they're oppressed. Well, gee, that's interesting. You know, this is critical theory. They don't know they're oppressed. We have to teach them that they're oppressed. They have to understand that that black bag that they're wearing is oppressive. Well, you know what? You guys say that you shouldn't go out in the sun because it's harmful to the skin. Have you ever seen a 70-year-old Saudi woman's skin? It's like porcelain. There's no wrinkles, right? Seriously, right? No skin cancer in Saudi Arabia for those women in the hottest place in the world, right? And then, you know, there's different, Saudi's like 4 different cultures. You have Eastern, Western, you have Northern, and Southern. They're very different. The Hijazis are very different. Even amongst the Hijazis, you have the Bedouin Hijazis, you have the cosmopolitan Hijazis that come, many of them, their ancestors came from different places. They're very different. You know, you have some of the most educated women in the world are in Saudi Arabia. Seriously. And you should talk to some of them. They don't feel oppressed. Yes, there are some women that would like to drive. One of the things they never tell you is that in Saudi Arabia, Bedouin women are permitted to drive. They're actually there's women that drive in Saudi Arabia. And the government allows them to drive. The Bedouin women. Why? Because a Bedouin woman will kick your butt. You know, and they worry about the women driving on their own, getting forced aside the road because there are a lot of workers. I was at a place where they had a rape on the house in Jeddah. A group of foreign workers literally raped a 13-year-old girl. You know, so you've got a population that they have real serious security considerations there. Also, driving is very dangerous. Now, Dr. Omar argues that if the women were allowed to drive, they would become better drivers. Right? So that's a case. But it's not like the Saudi government hasn't thought about giving women driver's licenses. It's an ongoing debate. But if that's your criteria for, women's oppression in Saudi Arabia, that they can't drive, no. So for me, there's things I don't like about Saudi culture, but there's also things that I love about Saudi culture. There's things that I don't like about American culture, things I like about American culture. But to make this blanket statement, all Saudis are oppressive, all Saudis are evil, what is that? It's just pure arrogance. That's all it is. It's just total ethnocentric, Eurocentric, Blanco-centric arrogance. That's all it is. We're better than you. It's as simple as that. Why? Well, because we are. Look how we treat our women. Look at Las Vegas. Look at all those naked women. They're free to expose their bodies. You guys put them in those bags, I mean, even one of their comedians said, he felt sorry for prostitutes in the West now because they used to be able to apply their wares with the way they dressed. He said, but now all our women dress like that. So they can't distinguish themselves. SubhanAllah. Some people are having problems understanding Arabic words. My apologies. I do apologize that. Sheikh bin Bayyah's argument is absolutely brilliant and much needed in these times of fitna. The question is, how can we educate our public and communicate this to our ulama? I mean, that's actually what he's trying to do. He's trying to communicate it to the ulama because he is a scholar. He's really not for the masses. I mean, people, when you hear him talk, he's just at a whole other level. Sometimes if you watch at the RIS when I had an interview with him, I thought he was very clear for even a common person. But it's very difficult for him to do that because he works in what E.D. Hirsch calls domain knowledge. In epistemology, in order for you to understand things, you have to have domain knowledge. So if you're having a discussion with a biologist and he uses terms like natural selection and randomness and mutations and stimuli and the Krebs cycle and things like that. If you don't have the domain knowledge from that science, you'll understand some things, but a lot is going to be lost on you. That's the way the usuli scholars are. There's a whole set of references that they have. And our ulama generally wrote like that. Many of our ulama wrote for other ulama. They didn't write for common people, and that's why their books are difficult to get into, because you have to have the domain knowledge. So that's part of it. And then we have, what I'm trying to do now is take his knowledge and translate it so that people can understand it, so you can understand it. Because these unfortunately, these things, it used to be in the past, most people knew their place in Islam. If you weren't a scholar, you didn't talk about Islam. That's no longer the case. Now, everybody's an alim, everybody's a usuli scholar, everybody's spent 50 years studying everything about the religion, and everybody can comment on it. So this is the age we're living in, so it's difficult to do that. So what are some of the steps that we can start within our communities? Well, part of it is to recognize that education is the most important thing in our religion, more than any other thing. Imam al-Bukhari, one of my favorite chapters, they say, this might be apocryphal, but they do say that the titles of his abwab that he got in dreams from the Prophet ﷺ. One of my favorite books, you know how you have blurbs? They call them endorsements. You have blurbs that are on the back of books. Like, when I did the Tahawiyah, I had two audiences in mind. One were Christians, and the other were Muslims. And that's why I have Nizam al-Yaqubi, who's one of the most learned modern scholars. He's in Bahrain. He wrote a blurb for me. And then Dr. Rowan Williams wrote a blurb for me. Why? So that a Christian would see that, Archbishop of Canterbury, that's interesting. So people have... one of my favorite books is Ibn Abi Jamrah's book, where his blurbs are all over 70 dreams that people had for him, that the Prophet ﷺ said, read Ibn Abi Jamrah's commentary on my hadith, because he understood what I meant. Over 70 dreams. So the back of the book is all blurbs from people that had dreams of the Prophet telling them to read his book, Bahjat al-Nufus. Subhanallah. And that's an amazing book, Bahjat al-Nufus. It's one of the most amazing books. He was the teacher of Ibn al-Hajj. He was an Andalusian who ended up in Egypt. Great, great scholar. But anyway, what was it? Why did I say that? Education, yeah. So, we have to educate people. It's really important to to learn our basic Islam. There are people now. What's that? Oh, thank you. Yeah, somebody got it. Imam al-Bukhari, they say, got dreams about the titles. But one of the titles of his chapters is Bab al-Ilmi qabla al-Qawli wal-Amal. The chapter of acquiring knowledge before you speak or do anything. So that pretty much wipes out most activists today. We don't want to start where you should start, in Dar al-Arqam. Medina doesn't happen until 13 years after intense study inside Dar al-Arqam. The Murabitun didn't save Andalusia until they'd spent years in the ribats studying and doing tahajjud and preparing themselves. So nobody wants to do that work. They just want everything to get fixed without doing any of the preparation. And ignorance causes far more damage. I mean, even the Arabs say, عَدُوٌ عَاقِلٌ وَلَا صَدِيقٌ جَاهِلٌ. Give me an intelligent enemy and not a stupid friend, an ignorant friend. Like, I'd rather have an intelligent enemy. That's the proverb. I'd rather have an intelligent enemy. أُفَضِّلُ عَدُوًا عَاقِلًا عَلَى صديق جاهل. لماذا؟ لأن العدو العاقل تفهمه وكيف يتصرف بعقلانيته. العدو الجاهل الصديق الجاهل يضرك من حيث يريد نفعك. He'll harm you. Your ignorant friend will harm you, trying to benefit you. Whereas the intelligent enemy, at least you can work out, if he's intelligent, what he's going to do. How does one convince someone, or even nice handwriting, but little small? How does one convince someone, or even know that the existing oppression will be the lesser of the two evils before their action is taken? Well, we have this thing called history, which is very, very important to study, right? Read The Whisper of the Blade and look at the history of revolutions, right? I mean, history will tell you. And that's why the Quran is 2/3 history. 2/3 of the Quran is history. No, because humans just repeat themselves. Oh, but it'll be different this time. Well, that's also history, because they always said that. It's going to be different this time. How do we balance oppression and justice and bring someone back to the middle path with our limited knowledge? Well, oppression, first of all, is a relative term. There's some degree of oppression, everybody. Like most of us are under that first category, ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. That's the majority of Muslims today. There's some that are muqtasidun, there's very few. السابقون السابقون أولئك المقربون. Right? I mean, the sabiqun are, they're few from the first. There are many from the first, but few from the later. And there's a khilaf, is that the first people or from the Sahaba? Right? Even kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. That, they say, was for the Sahaba. Kuntum. Right? You were. That's for the Sahaba. But even the ones that don't say, they said, you have to fulfill the shart, right? تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله. أمر بالمعروف نهي عن المنكر إيمان بالله. we should condemn injustice when we're capable, but for the alim, he does it with his tongue. For the common person, he does it with his heart. Ibn Omar, when he saw something he couldn't change, and I learned this very early from a Mauritanian scholar. If he couldn't change something, he used to, if he saw it, he would say, Allahumma innahu munkar ankarna. Oh Allah, this is a munkar and we reject it. وَلَوْ اسْتَطَعْنَا أو وَلَوْ قَدَرْنَا لَغَيَّرْنَا. And if we were able, we would change it. Now, obviously, nowadays, you would have to say that almost everything you looked at. But choose your battles, you know, Syria, I mean, what's happening? Allahumma innahu munkar ankarna. You know, Palestine, if I could change it, I would change it. Really, I would change it. The best thing Muslims could do is educate people about the Palestinian issue. That's the best thing. Most people are ignorant. Most Americans, if they really knew what was happening, they would change their opinion. But they don't know. They think that the Palestinians are all these evil terrorists, and unfortunately we have some people there confirming those stereotypes by a lot of their activities. Just because, you know, they're using strategies of power with utter weakness, which is not an intelligent thing to do in my estimation. I think they're really wrong. And also, a lot of their rhetoric is just wrong. I believe that, you know. But, you know, the Palestinians, like for me, it's like ma'durun. You know, you just leave the Palestinians. That's how I view Palestine. I'm not going to judge those people. I'm not going to, even the ones that do the crazy things, I'm just not going to judge them because God knows their conditions. I mean, I'm not in Gaza, and I don't want to make any judgments on the Palestinians, really. But people, you can drive people crazy, and when you drive people crazy, they can act like, you know, they're crazy because you've driven them that way. And the conditions, the social conditions in that country, the racism, an incredibly racist country. You know, it's an apartheid country according to Nelson Mandela. You know, and of all people, he would know what apartheid is, right? But he considered Israel to be an apartheid country. You know, it's a state based on a racist doctrine. You know, so, I mean, democracy is for everybody, right? If you're going to have a democratic state, it's not just for one group as opposed to other groups. And certainly not all Jews are racist, and I would never say that. You know, I made a statement many, many years ago, and, you know, it still haunts me to this day, but I just didn't qualify it. You know, some Jews are racist, just like some Muslims are racist, you know. But there are many Jews committed to social justice. There's a lot of Jews that work in the United States for Palestinian rights, you know, Jews for Peace. There are many good organizations, and there are many good Jews amongst them. And that's my position. I don't like to judge groups. I don't like to lump everybody into these. This is one of the problems with a lot of modern Muslim mentality. Kuffar. They're all kuffar. You know, what's interesting about Muslims, modern Muslims, يصنف المسلمين ويعمم الكفار. والقرآن يصنف الكفار ويعمم المسلمين. هذا غريب. Huh? Like the Quran clearly differentiates between different types of non-believers. Like لا ينهاكم عن الذين لم يقاتلكم في الدين. It's fine. Those who don't fight you in your religion, right? ولا يخرجكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم. Be good towards them. Show them bir. And تقسطوا إليهم. Even share your wealth with them. Allah says that in the Quran, right? But with the Muslims, إنما المؤمنون إخوة, all the believers, but Muslims, يصنف المسلمين ويعمم الكفار. هم كلهم كفار يا أخي. كلهم كفار. You know, Allah يدمرهم. الله يؤتم أولادهم ويؤرمل نساءهم. اللهم يعني زعزعت ما تحت أقدامهم. You know, all these du'as they make, you know. I mean, like I used to listen to the du'a in Ramadan, those long du'as, and they're all doing those, you know, make their children orphans and make their women widows. And I'm thinking, you've been doing this for a long time and nothing's changed. Why don't you, Allahumma yani ahdihim, Allahumma ahdihim. You know, why not ask for their guidance? There's a beautiful hadith in Sahih Bukhari, one of my favorite hadiths. The Prophet sent this group to Daws, one of the tribes of Yemen. And they came back and they said, Ya Rasulullah, Daws, you know, inna Dawsa qad abat wa kafarat. You know, they rejected Islam and disbelieved. Fad'u alayhim. Imprecate against them, make a dua against them. So, tawalla al-qibla, the Prophet turned to the qibla, wa rafa'a yaday. فَظَنَّ النَّاسِ أَنَّهُ سَيَدْعُ عَلَيْهِمْ. And people thought that he was going to make a dua against them. And he said, Allahumma ahdi dawsan wa ati bihim. Oh Allah, guide Daws and bring them to me. And they came, and in that wafd was Abu Huraira, you know, and they became Muslim. You know, he didn't make dua. He rarely made dua. He made dua a few times against people, but his overall thing was rahmah for people. But if there was no rahmah in the people, you know, then obviously man la yarham la yurham. Anyway, so for some people, you know, are the rights of individuals and communities not being taken away by injustice of tyrants? Is their justice only with God in the hereafter? For some people, their justice is only with God in the hereafter. That's just a fact of life. And that's why we believe in Yawm al-Qiyamah. You know, every dog gets his day. Even the animals get justice on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Every dog gets its day. That's a proverb in English. And that's taken from a spiritual reality. Every dog gets its day. Even the animals will have their justice on Yawm al-Qiyamah. From other animals as well as from humans. So even animals that oppressed other animals. Alhamdulillah. I am being informed that time is up. But time could be down, you know, if you think about it. Allah yubarak fikum. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.